like to call this meeting of the Bellingham City Council committees to order. First committee today is Public Works, Public Safety. Terry Borneman, chair, and joining me on our committee is Michael Lilliquist and Jack Weiss. We have one item on it. Wow, one item. Hey, I like it. One item before us today, and that's an ordinance adopting a base rate for the 2015 transportation impact fee pursuant to Chapter 19.06 of the Bellingham Municipal Code. Ted?
Thank you. Good afternoon. Ted Carlson, Public Works Department. The Municipal Code outlines the process for the council adopting the base transportation impact fee rate. It's something that council does every year, sometime after you adopt the 6-year TIP, Transportation Improvement Program, but certainly before the end of the year. So there's an ordinance in front of you today to adopt the base rate for 2015. And as you recall, the process for establishing the rate is a process of looking back to the previous 5 years actual construction costs, looking at our current 2014 year construction costs, and then the planned expenditures over the next 6 years that were adopted in the TIP, and really looking only at capacity projects. So we don't consider maintenance projects like overlay, but we look at projects that does include sidewalk projects because they do provide trip capacity, the way we determine trips. And we don't include state or federal grants in that calculation. It's only local money, so money that the city contributes, so street fund, REIT, things of that nature. So when we go through that calculation, we do see a slight decrease in the proposed 2015 base rate. It is $1,907 per PM peak trip now in 2014. And as we calculated it, and there is a calculation sheet attached to your agenda bill, the rate for 2015 would be $1,869 per PM peak trip. So a slight reduction, and staff would recommend that council approve the ordinance. It does take council action in the form of adopting an ordinance. We have done some outreach to the builders and the BIA and letting folks know that it does appear that the TIF rate will go down in 2015. So with that, any questions that you may have?
Michael?
Well, I'll be, of course, moving to recommend approval of this, but I did want to bring up something and make sure, Ted, that I was correct about this. We've been praised for lowering the rate last year, and we may be praised again this year, but that's really kind of a misunderstanding. We're making no policy change. We're not deciding to lower it. It really is a calculation based on what we've actually committed to build and have built in the past. And so that rate will go up and down really depending on our public works projects, the transportation capacity projects. So it's not really a decision now. It's really more a decision when we decide to build or not build, say, a new bridge.
Yeah, that's correct. It is a calculation. And so as long as the city retains the current practice for calculating the TIF, where we look at actual construction costs and programmed capacity construction costs moving forward. It is a calculation, and the adoption of the 6-year TIP is a big part of that because we do use the 6 years moving forward. And it's been very stable over the last few years, so it doesn't fluctuate too much. And largely that's because we've been doing about the same amount in terms of local money towards capital projects. And the real fluctuation depends on how much state and federal money the city's fortunate enough to
that
get.
doesn't enter into the TIF calculation.
Right. Yes.
Okay.
I would move that we recommend approval tonight.
Mm-hmm. Jack?
I'm a little bit, I'm going to support the recommendation, but I am a bit concerned about just overall how we go about charging impact fees and what the real nexus is to the impact itself. And Ted, I brought this up to you last week, use the latest development up in King Mountain where the developer is putting in 170 homes, single-family homes, probably get charged maybe $340,000 total, at a little less than $2,000 a piece. And that $340,000 is supposed to go and deal with the impacts. And even though there's, the developer will build a small chunk of James Street, We're putting in $3.8 million in a roundabout, basically, to serve that same neighborhood. We're putting in approximately another $20 million worth of improvements on James Street and Orchard to be able to help service that project. And, you know, we're putting in more, by having that development in there, we're also going to have a lot more impacts on Bakerview itself. And I see that $340,000 just doesn't cut it. It's just not going to be enough to be able to go and handle the impacts of that growth. And yes, everybody else in the community is going to be able to benefit from that, but the specific benefits, the weighted benefits, I think, are going to be much more favorable for this new development on the outskirts of our city limits. And I just feel that, you know, we ended up a number of years ago going away from zoned approaches to impact fees, and we came up with this one size fits all, and then come back and have these incentives in different places. But I feel like the impacts themselves are still not being adequately addressed for the community, and that we continue to subsidize at a tremendous cost any new incoming people. So it's just it's a comment. I don't know if you want to comment on any of that, but
Yeah, I think I will briefly. So the basis of this calculation and really the way we fundamentally go about impact fees from a transportation perspective goes back to the 2006 study when we adopted this new process and did a calculation looking at the transportation system as a whole, as you mentioned, going away from the zones to one system, because we really did see that the system does function as a whole and that people do utilize more than just the area with which they develop or live. And so we did look at it as a whole. And that calculation and that study determined that 52% of the capital projects, transportation projects, could be attributed to growth. And that's something that could be debated. We could probably go back and look at that. But it was a sound study that used methodology at the time to determine how much of the capital project could be attributed to improving the existing system and benefiting the users of that system versus needing to be done for growth itself. So 52%, and you see that equation if you look at the calculation sheet that we use that. So that's kind of the starting point, and whether or not that could be debated, it can be, but that's where we're at. The second part of the question, I think, is individual development. They certainly pay impact fees, and that is part of it, but remember that developers also, they do the developer extensions, pay for the frontage improvements, and also pay for the extension. So in the case you mentioned, they'll have to improve James Street to serve their development, but also eventually, because that project is in the 20-year plan, make the connection up to the north to Van Wyck, which is substantial over time, not this first phase. And then you also have other development regulations, as well as through SEPA, offsite mitigation. So in the case of the James Street Bakerview intersection, we have to do a traffic impact analysis for the development. And if the development requires improvements at any of the intersections or segments of road that it impacts through SEPA, we can require them to do that mitigation. So it's not just impact fees. We really do look at it as a combination of developer regulations, developer extensions and frontage improvements, as well as offsite mitigation if required. In that case, it wasn't required. It's not, at least not in phase one. So it's a good point that impact fees on their own, they're not paying for all of the capital projects, but in our methodology, it's just one piece of the pie.
can I ask a follow-up?
Yes.
So you're talking about the fact that they, under SEPA, that they might help with the intersection, at that intersection? But we're going to be spending $3.8 million of state and local monies to build that, and then phase two will happen after it's already there. SEPA's not going to actually trigger because we already have the capacity at that point, so they're not going to be on the hook to go and help with contributing to the project that we had already built.
Not through offsite mitigation, but they're certainly paying through impact fees, the impact fee calculation. And if phase two requires a connection to the north, offsite mitigation will likely cause improvements to need to be made on the Van Wyck. So you're right. I mean, you have to look at it in sequence, and as the timing of the development, do they pay on the front end as part of offsite mitigation, making improvements that are required, or are they paying through their impact fees after those improvements are made by the jurisdiction and calculated as part of the impact fees and included in the impact fees? Because the local contribution to the James Baker View, when we construct that, will be part of the impact fee calculation. So future phases of this development will have to pay through their impact fees for that. So it really is a system. It goes back to looking at all of these components need to be considered as a component of the whole. When we update the capital plan and the 20-year plan as part of the comp plan, we'll have a new set of projects that will trickle into the 6-year plan and be calculated through this. But, it really does go back to the way we calculate impact fees. They are low when we look at our neighboring jurisdictions, but there's a benefit to that as well. So we really try to look at all of the pieces of it. This is a sound methodology. It's been used in other jurisdictions. It's been challenged through the court in other jurisdictions, and it has upheld. So that's important to us too, that it's a defensible model to charge.
Michael?
I really appreciate what Jack is saying. I think this is exactly what the council needs to talk about, maybe not today during this item, but the policy here I think is very clear. We want fairness, tax fairness, cost fairness, and if it's possible that developers are being overcharged for their share, then they should be reduced, or if they're being undercharged for their share, then they should be increased. So it's fairness in proportion of costs. In this one case, you say it's a $3.8 million roundabout. Let's just assume that's the only improvement in the area. If 52% of that should be paid for by development in the area, then that's a bill of $1.9 million over the lifespan of that area. If this one project puts in $300,000, and if over the next few years the rest of the development finally makes good on that, so a full $1.9 million comes in, well, then we're good. But we don't know right now whether we're good or not, and we don't know what other impacts and what other improvements there are. So there's a lot of math that goes into this, but I think the principle really is fairness.
It is, and remember on that, since we're using that example, it's only fair to point out that of that, if we use Jack's number of $3.2 million, you're probably only going to have 400,000 local money in it. The rest is all state and federal grant, not included in this calculation.
And it's still tax money, so I count it.
But we don't count it in this equation.
But in terms of tax fairness, I would still count it.
Go ahead.
This is not it's not a question of tax fairness. It's a question of fairness of how we calculate the TIF. So it's not appropriate to include it.
Jack and then Gene?
It's actually an issue of opportunity costs in the sense of those grant monies could be used for other projects in the community if it wasn't for something like this. Yeah, I guess it's not to go and think that the development projects up there are only going to impact on that roundabout. I think is looking at the nexus of it in a wrong way, because if they're using that roundabout, then they're also going to be using James Street, and we're putting $20 million into James Street and Orchard Street that they're going to be using there too. So, how far out you go when you put in a development that is going to be car-centric. If we have an infill and we're putting that right next to a bus line, people are using it for bus services, or walking right next to their shopping center, that's different compared to a car-centric development that's way out in the sticks. And the amount of impact that those types of developments are going to be much greater than having infill. Yet we charge, for the most part, we charge the same, except for the.
That's not correct.
Well, except for the discounts that we
Up to
approved.
50%.
Yeah.
So if they develop under the scenario that you talked about, they can get up to a 50% reduction because their impact is less. I mean, there's a full recognition that if you develop within the urban core and you have non-motorized, you have transit, you may work closer and you get internal trip calculation. Our methodology does that very thing and allows a 50% trip reduction. I mean, it's one of the few that does do that. So we truly are recognizing when a development is more auto-centric, in your words, creates more trips, versus one that is going to have fewer because of where it's built and because of the type of development. That is recognized in this program.
Except for I would argue that the reductions are not enough. The 50% is not enough. Because we're talking about a project that has all car-centric issues versus another one that, where people have options and legitimate options to be able to have alternatives.
We could go all day on it. If the council would like to revisit, and I think we are, the mayor's working on impact fees, development-related fees, including park impact fees, including utility connections, and how those can be modified for opportunity zones or infill development. That's a project that we're working on, and I believe we'll be coming back to council sometime after the first of the year.
I was just going to say, it sounds like a good project to bring before the Public Works Committee in the 2015 during a work session to have that fuller discussion, because right now, the parameters that we have are set.
Yeah, Ted,
Gene?
I know, I'm going way back again, but when I first looked at this program, it was far out of whack back then than it is now. Do you have a percentage of what is recovered on latecomer fee? I'm talking about, you talk about one developer that builds, but then there's going to be a whole string of things going on. We used to have a percentage of what we get back after
Yeah,
what we put in, and
we
I
can
can't
get
remember
that.
what that was.
It does move around a little bit, and if you look at impact fees versus what we pay in transportation, it is a fairly small dollar amount. It's going to be in the 15 to 20% that we get back.
It used to be worse.
Yeah,
A lot worse.
and so I mean it is a good policy discussion. I think as Committee Chair Borneman said, we'll bring something back after the first of the year.
And
And
then
it'll be a bigger picture. It's going to have beyond impact fees,
But then
transportation impact fees.
You look at page, what is it, 20, on page 22, where you have the outlying areas, you have Ferndale, $3,243, the base rate, $2,783, Ferndale Town, $2,070. I would argue those are way out of whack because nothing's being built out there. So there's the thing that gets off-centered is if they're too high, you're not going to have anything. But I do understand, and I know we talked about it before, to have a conversation on school impact fees, park impact fees, traffic impact fees. I think it all lumped together.
We have a motion before us. Any other comments? All those in favor of recommending approval tonight, answer aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, unanimous. We will recommend approval tonight. That's the end of the Public Safety, Public Works Committee, and that